clerk to call our meeting to order. This Bigger Regional Wastewater Agency regular meeting, January 25th. Call the meeting to order. Murray, would you like to do this in the budget, please?
Wait, real quick, we have to have John's stuff first.
Which one's first? Okay, I'm sorry. This agenda. If you could, hold that for a moment. Well, this is in accordance with AB 2449, which is a new law in the state of California. So in accordance with AB 2449, which modifies government code 54953, Vice Chair Green has requested to participate remotely for just this cause. Vice Chair Green will provide a general description of the need to participate remotely, disclose whether he has any individuals 18 years of age or older present in the room at the remote location, and the general nature of their relationship. The governing board will vote on allowing participation. Vice Chairman Green?
No one in the room with me, and the magic word is COVID.
Okay.
And is the location in Oregon still available for public participation?
Yes.
Just need a motion and a second.
Is there a motion?
Motion to approve.
I'll second that.
Move the second, roll call.
Vice Chair Green,
Aye.
Director Miller,
Aye.
Director Moe. Aye. Director Walsh,
Aye.
and Chair Herrick.
Aye. Okay, let's do this in the pledge of allegiance, please.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Do we need a roll call?
For approval of the agenda?
Just say that we're all here.
No, just for.
No, we do not.
I need a motion for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Second.
Who is-
Give us signify by saying
Aye.
aye. Aye. Aye. Any opposed? Hearing none.
I have to do a roll call vote, Chair Herrick.
I'm
Since
sorry?
John, yeah, since John is joining via Zoom. So Vice Chair Green,
Aye.
Director Miller,
Aye.
Director Moe. Aye. Director Walsh.
Aye.
And Chair Herrick.
Right. We'll eventually learn this new system. I'm sure it's gonna come. Okay, with that, public forum, public testimony is permitted to send only consent calendar items and other matters not listed in the posted agenda within the subject matter jurisdiction of the agency. State law prohibits the agency from taking action on the items not listed on the posted agenda. Public comment on items listed on the posted agenda will be taken each time the item is called for discussion. And with that, if we have any member of the public who would like to speak. See none. Hearing none, we'll move forward then with item 5, presentation introduction. It's 5A Replenish, particular project update from Water Systems Consulting.
Before we start, I'd just like to note that both of the presentations tonight are available on the agency's website at borrower.org. And with that, I'd like to introduce from Water Systems Consulting, Elaine Carlson, who's here to give you a presentation tonight on the status update of the Replenish project. Elaine?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. As Dave mentioned, I'm Elaine Carlson with Water Systems Consulting. I'm the consultant program manager for Big Bear, working with the agency team and our consultant team to manage and coordinate all the parallel activities that are ongoing to keep this project moving forward. I'm going to give you an update tonight. I'm going to walk through some of the key initiatives that are ongoing right now. Happy to take questions at the end, and also feel free to stop me at any time. Oh, bear with me. Discussion, cover an update on the pilot study and the environmental review process. Those are two key things that are on the critical path, and there's been some significant progress in recent months. So more to share there. And then a recap of the regulatory timeline, grant funding, to share some new resources that have been developed to characterize project benefits and share that out. And then also review the program schedule. So for the pilot study, just to note, I'm going to reorder these slides a little bit just to make sure it flows. So I'm skipping here to slide 6 if anyone's following along in the packet, and I'll come back to slide 5 again. So I want to start with a recap of the advanced purification facility that is really the central component of Replenish right there. The existing water treatment plant is going to be supplemented with a full advanced treatment facility that includes these 4 processes: nutrient removal, ultrafiltration, reverse osmosis, and then UV disinfection in an advanced oxidation process. In the next slides, I'll explain a little bit more about what each of those are. This treatment train is really state of the art. This is the best available treatment for water reuse projects. There are many projects in California who are using this treatment train, and it's well established within the regulations that it's effective. And so some projects may, leveraging the performance that we've seen in other places, may move forward without doing demonstration testing. However, for Replenish, we feel that it's important to actually test these facilities on site for a few reasons. There are a couple of unique things about this project, and one is the really low discharge requirements that we expect for the lake. We have to get those nutrient levels very low in order to protect the water quality. And then also the cold climate. Some of these biological processes don't perform as well in cold climate, so we really need to make sure that we have a year-round process that can meet those discharge requirements, because it's so important to the success of the program. So the purpose of bringing those facilities on site primarily is to demonstrate the performance of this process for these site-specific conditions and regulatory agencies. The vendors are really confident that they can meet the design criteria, but we really need to see that and demonstrate it here, and that's going to give the project team and the regulators a lot more confidence moving forward. And we also want to make sure that this treatment process, as I said, this is the best available treatment process, to confirm that it's going to be viable to meet those target treatment levels. And then finally, we want to quantify the total system recovery for product water. We're just going to look a bit more about that in the next slide. But because we're using a membrane reverse osmosis product, there's some brine waste. And so we're not recovering 100% of the water. It's really important for us to figure out what that mix is so that we can get the right facility sizes. I'll talk a little bit more about that on the next slides. So this biological nutrient removal process, this is going to be the first additional process after Barwa's existing treatment. And this is biological, chemical, and physical process. It's going to remove most of the organics and help us get those nitrogen and phosphorus levels a lot lower. And this is the one that's going to be the most sensitive to cold weather performance. So we're going to bring this out first. You'll see on the timeline. This is going to be on site here in February, and that'll start us still with cold weather so we can verify both cold weather and spring performance. That process is going to be followed by ultrafiltration, which is a membrane process that removes suspended solids and bacteria from the water. From there, it's going to go to a reverse osmosis process. This is a high pressure membrane with those really, really small pore sizes. It's going to remove additional impurities like salts, bacteria, viruses, in the pharmaceuticals and personal care products that are often a concern. This is the process that generates the brine waste that we'll need to deal with on site. So all of these processes are going to be highlighted on site. And then the final one is a UV disinfection and advanced oxidation process. And this is where UV light is combined with an oxidant to create oxidizing radicals. And so what they do is they attack and they decompose any remaining contaminants in the water. So it breaks them down so that they're no longer harmful. This is the process that's required for most of our indirect potable reuse type projects. And it's the best available technology. And it's combined with UV light that also provides disinfection for the water. So those 4 processes combined are going to produce what the industry knows as purified water. It is higher in quality than drinking water. It meets all federal and state regulations. And so throughout this treatment process that we're going to pilot, we'll be able to collect that data and show what the water looks like before it goes in, And after it comes out of all these processes, to really prove the purity of the water that's being produced, to be able to show that to the regulators, as well as test for some of those things that we often get questions about, right? Like the pharmaceuticals and the personal care products. We'll be able to have data to really show those removals and demonstrate the level of safety that this treatment provides.
Before we move on, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Knowing how reverse osmosis works, ultrafiltration seems like an extra step.
Well,
Explain the reason why it's there.
I can, yeah. So the pore sizes on the reverse osmosis membranes are very, very small. One way that's used to describe it is 1/300th the size of a human hair. And so that additional sort of pre-treatment step, the ultrafiltration, is needed to clean up the water so that those membranes don't get clogged. So we're removing more of those impurities so that those reverse osmosis membranes can be more effective.
Thank you.
So the final process, and this doesn't have anything to do with producing water, but this is the brine management process that's going to help deal with the brine waste that's generated from the RO. And so what we're looking at is a brine minimization process. So that includes the first step here is an additional small RO process, basically. And then it goes into what we call a pelletizer that's going to produce like a solid salt pellet that can be disposed of. There is still a small liquid brine stream from this process. And the concept is to construct evaporation ponds on site here at Barrow on the available land and evaporate that off. And so the really key thing with piloting this piece of equipment is to confirm vendors are telling us that they can get up to 98% total recovery. So only 2% of the water that we're treated is going for disposal and for evaporation. They're pretty confident in that, but we need to confirm that because it dictates the size of the evaporation ponds that get constructed on site. And as you can imagine, the land available is a potential constraint there. And also we want to confirm that that is within budget. So this particular process, we are having a hard time getting on site to pilot. The vendor quotes came in significantly higher than anticipated. However, the vendor, that there's really only one vendor that makes this product, and they're working with us trying to figure out more creative ways. And what they've proposed is actually to do the facility or to do the pilot at their research and development facility in Israel. So the concept is that we would ship barrels of the purified water that's produced from the pilot here to their research and development facility, and they'll do the testing on site of this equipment. We anticipate that the cost and timeline for that will be significantly lower than trying to do that pilot on site. We're still in initial conversations with that vendor, trying to sort that out, but that looks like a really promising opportunity to reduce the cost of this pilot program.
Another question.
Yes.
The brine that's produced, is that it's called salt, pure sodium? It's zero or some not sodium, sodium, whatever it is, mixed salt. And the only reason why I'm asking the question right now that brine is actually put on our roads before it snows. Is it the same type of brine? It's different types of brine?
I think it will include some of the same compounds, but it'll also include some of those additional impurities that are filtered out through the reverse osmosis process. So I don't have a solid answer for you, but part of the piloting process is going to be to sample that brine to understand what it's made up of, what those constituents are, and make sure that we'll be able to dispose of it in conventional ways. We don't anticipate that they're hazardous or difficult to dispose of.
So I guess I'm leading to could be used on roads if it's the right content.
I am not aware of an application where that's been done. However, the pellets that this pelletizer can produce has been known to be used in industrial processes. So for example, a batch plant for concrete might be an opportunity. So that is something that we're going to look into as we get further after the pilot to see, what is the composition of these pellets and is it a marketable product? Because it may be. I'm not aware of anyone that's used it for road de-icing, but there are some other industrial applications potentially to avoid just disposing of it.
I have a question.
Sure.
So the way I understand this then is that you're going to just take several sample barrels and ship it off to Israel, and the balance is just turned right back into the stream that goes out to the CERN. Is that right there?
Correct.
Yes.
Quick question.
Yes, John.
That sample is going to be taken after the other two processes before, correct?
After, yeah, so it'll be taken after all of up through the UV advanced oxidation. So at that point, it's considered purified water. So we're going to send samples of the purified water that's produced by the pilot. Sorry, the purified water goes back into the plant. The RO reject that comes from the RO process is what we'll store up and send to Israel.
I understand. The other question I have is, do we know what the life expectancy or the prediction of life expectancy for the filters are?
Yeah, the filters. So we have a few different filters in the system. So there's membrane cartridges basically as part of the ultrafiltration and the RO as well.
And that's what I was referring to, was the membrane cartridge.
Yeah, so I think it varies a bit by vendor as well, and I can't remember the number offhand. Those replacement costs are included in the O&M. I think it's on the range of about 10 years. It does depend a little bit by vendor, but that's kind of the average of what we're seeing.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to see on those replacement at some point.
Yeah, we can provide additional detail on that. We have that.
Thank you. That's all I have.
Okay, so I'll move on to the pilot plan timeline. In October of 2022, we started the pilot study planning and requested proposals from various vendors to bring the equipment up here for testing. And while the vendor responses took a little bit longer than we anticipated, we're happy to report that signed the first agreement here in January, and the denitrification filters are currently planned to be shipped here to Barrow and arrive in February for startup. And then the additional processes will be added after that, about a 2-week spacing in between, just to give staff time to get them started up. And then starting in March, we can start doing some water quality monitoring, where we're taking water quality samples upstream of the pilot plant at key places in between and on the effluent. So we have data on the quality and the performance of each of these treatment processes. And we plan to run that pilot through probably about early July. We'd also like to capture a couple of your peak holiday weeks just to see if there are any changes in performance when those flows get a little bit higher. So running past the 4th of July and including Memorial Day should give us a pretty good picture of kind of the range of flows, as well as some winter temperatures and then into spring and summer. So we'll wrap up the pilot around July. And then it'll take a little bit longer to get all the data back into a pilot plan report. But you'll see there in June, we have a milestone for start final design. We do anticipate that by that point in the pilot, we'll have enough data to really see how the performance of these processes is working. And we'll be able to initiate those next phases of design.
I had one more question. When you talk about the evaporation pond, and maybe this is a question for David, is there just not enough room on site to handle the amount of brine that comes out of the system?
Yeah, so the amount of brine that we're talking about, yeah, I mean, it's gonna take, I think it's like 27 acres is the number.
Okay.
So you're talking about a very large footprint for the evaporation pond. I would say, basically most of the property that we actually have,
Okay.
in balance of the property that we actually have.
So for that reason, it is important that we make sure to demonstrate those high levels of removal, that 98% recovery that I was talking about, because If the process does generate more brine than that, and it's too much brine to handle on site, that could become a challenge figuring out different ways to manage that brine. Again, the vendors are really confident that they can keep those numbers, but it's really important that we confirm that. So we should have that data here by the summer. Any questions on the piloting process before we move on to the next section? Okay, so environmental documentation, this is the activity that's on the critical path because we have to have the CEQA document adopted before we can apply for some of the funding programs. And obviously as well before construction, but this really is guiding some of the funding timelines. So in December, really kicked this process off, issued the notice of preparation for the CEQA document. That included a project description that went out for public review. In January, there were 2 scoping meetings, one at DWP's office and one here at Rolapp. And the purpose of those scoping meetings was just to request public input on any issues that the public thinks should be evaluated in EIR. And so most of those, I'll show you on the next slide, generally the feedback that we got, most of those things we anticipated and already had planned within the analysis. So we'll be working with the environmental consultant over the next few months. They're completing the analysis. We'll make sure that we incorporate appropriate responses to the comments that were received from the public. And we anticipate a draft EIR going out for public review around July. There'll be at least a 30-day process where that's open for public comment. And those comments will be incorporated, and along about October, we anticipate being able to do a final EIR. There's a public hearing to adopt that. And from there, we'll hand off the CEQA documents to a federal agency where we anticipate that it'll be the Bureau of Reclamation, potentially EPA, because of the federal funding for the program. Those agencies need to do their own federal environmental clearance process, and they don't get that started until after CEQA is done. And that could take, somewhere in the range of 6 months potentially. But this is all still completed well ahead of when anticipated construction begins. So really, this is, we're keeping this moving to allow us to get those funding opportunities.
So another question for you. Once the draft EIR is published and you have your public comments, I mean, you've got 2 months in there to respond to public comments and do all your public noticing that's required by law to get that in October. I just, just like to point out to you, that's a very aggressive timetable for an EIR.
For replying to comments.
Yes, and for getting it on an agenda based upon public noticing requirements. I mean, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty positive this is probably subject to tribal notification, which is a 90-day notification. So I'm pointing that out to you that you may want to check tribal notification requirements for that.
Sorry, your microphone's cutting out.
Tribal notification is 90 days. So I'm going to assume that this definitely is probably part of that process, and that you need to build that in to your public process.
I know the environmental team has already started the tribal notification process, and I do believe that that's built in here, but we will, to your point, verify with them. And the July date for the draft EIR is, we hope that that's conservative. In reality, we're hopeful that that will go out sooner. And if that's the case, that will give us a little bit more buffer on that adoption. But I'll share your comments with the environmental team.
Thank you.
So just a kind of an overview of the nature of the comments that we heard from the environmental review scoping comments. And again, these are things that people are basically saying, hey, I want you to look at this as part of the EIR. I want you to evaluate what these impacts are so that when the draft EIR comes out, that analysis will be included. And hopefully this will limit the extent of the comments that we get on the draft EIR if we're able to address these ahead of time. So the main things were, just questions about water quality impacts in Big Bear Lake and then downstream for the water that's released from the dam. And again, I just walked you through the treatment process. And so I think we'll also have some data from the pilot to include at that point to be able to demonstrate how pure this water is and anticipate being able to resolve water quality concerns. We do also plan to meet with some of the downstream stakeholders to share more information about the project and make sure that we understand any concerns and can resolve those at the time. There were some comments on reduced flow to Lucerne Valley. We certainly expected that. A few more details than we had anticipated, asking about, dust control for the site, and some things like that. So we have a meeting tomorrow with the environmental team to address, we're going to talk about how those things will be addressed in the EIR. But again, we have data available to address that, and we had anticipated in the analysis. Some comments on just making sure that there's consistency with the 1977 judgment for Big Bear Lake, which of course is an ongoing litigation process. Questions about brine, energy use and encouragement to include renewable energy resources. And then a letter to make sure that we were aware of the requirements to consult with Native American tribes, which of course the environmental team is. And then finally, 3 letters of support from local residents who took the time to just write a note of encouragement. So that's always nice to see. Any questions on environmental review for the moment? So the regulatory process is ongoing. This slide is basically a picture of where we've been. And it's been a kind of a long path. So we first started talking to the regulators about this project in January 2019. And then in February 2020, we submitted the official permit application, which is known as the report of waste discharge. And so the time in between initiating that contact and submitting the report of waste discharge was really the most critical activity to coordinate with the regional board. That's when we're meeting with them and we're talking with them to understand how they're going to regulate this project, what the discharge requirements might be. And the other thing we were doing during that time is really trying to figure out if there were any ways to reduce the cost of the project. We looked at doing lower levels of treatment, not as many processes. And ultimately through a combination of, the lake modeling analysis, discussions with the regional board, the Division of Drinking Water and review of the regulations, it became clear that full advanced treatment was the only way to proceed with this project. And so it did take a while to get to that point, but we now have confidence that we do have the right scope of improvements that are needed for this project to be successful. And, following the submittal of that permit application, we had a little bit of back and forth. The regional board provided comments, we're providing responses. But in December, regional board staff did confirm their approach to regulate the project would be to require that full advanced treatment and some additional water quality monitoring. And so at this point, we do feel like we have a pretty solid understanding of what those discharge requirements will be. Although there's still, I'll show you on the next slide, quite a few more steps in the process to actually get the permit. This is no longer on the critical path because we do understand what we anticipate those requirements will be.
I'm sorry, another question. Thanks. So when you say regional board staff confirm their approach, is that a written letter from their director or their board? How do you get that?
Yeah, it's an email from the lead water quality engineer who is on this case. Ultimately, issuing the permit is a decision of the elected board itself, right? And so staff can't actually tell us, yes, I will issue you a permit. That's not their legal decision. But what they did tell us was, yes, that's how we see it. That's what staff intends to recommend to the board, and that's how we would intend to regulate the project. Ultimately, it's a board decision. They did request additional data as well, water quality data, and I'll show you on the next slide. There are quite a few more steps to the process, but I think that that's probably as far as staff really felt it was appropriate to go.
Thank you.
So with the water quality board, with the process we have to go through to purify the water, Because initially started off, it wasn't as elaborate. And I'm sure that you have experts who came up with the initial ideas. They have their experts. Is there science behind it that says that this expense is worth doing this to the water before it goes in? Or is it, is this an opinion or science?
Well, there are a few different things that are triggering this level of treatment. And one of them is the discharge requirements to the lake. And those numbers are established in a basin plan, which is a legal document governing protection of environmental quality. And those standards were set, probably back in the 60s and 70s when, the lake was very pure and before there was, some of the development and the runoff that we see now. And so the federal water quality laws prohibit degradation of water quality. And so in order to meet those water quality regulations that are written into the basin plan, we do have to do 100% RO. That is the only way to get the nutrients down to the levels that are required because of nutrient impairments in the lake, the TMDL, the total maximum daily load that's been regulating discharges to the lake. So initially, we did believe that we would have to do 100% RO. During the early phases of coordinating with the regional board, we tested if there were any other ways, if there were any more creative regulatory pathways to get off of that, because that is a costly process. And ultimately, I came to understand that there wouldn't be any way that staff was willing to permit based on the data that was available to them and their need to uphold those federal water quality laws. More recently, that final process, the UV advanced oxidation process, that was added in response to concerns about constituents of emerging concern, and this came from the Division of Water. And the science on that is evolving, right? Our ability to test and detect those constituents and to understand the impact on human health. The industry is still learning more about that. And so a lot of those things aren't regulated yet, but they're on everyone's mind. And so that is an evolving science that doesn't yet have that trigger that's telling us you absolutely must do this. However, it was clear that the regulators would not be willing to permit the project unless that component was added because they felt that it was necessary to protect public health. Does that answer your question?
It does. I appreciate that. Essentially, water quality, what is your thought on water quality of the lake once we start putting water in? It seems like, in my opinion, it would improve over a period of time.
Yes. We did engage a limnologist, Dr. Michael Anderson, who's done analysis on Big Bear Lake historically and also in Canyon Lake. It's very well respected by the regional board. And so we had the pleasure of having him on our team. He developed a lake model where he evaluated the impacts of different levels of discharge. And so we did have him look at a lower level of discharge, like if we only did, ultrafiltration and we didn't do RO. And his model determined that would have degraded the water quality in the lake. But the project that we have proposed now with full advanced treatment is the quality that we're putting into the lake is much, much better than the watershed runoff, right? Which is the other water source to the lake. And so it will improve the quality of the lake.
When the model was done, was it done at different levels of the lake?
Yes, it was done over a period between, I think he looked at 2009 to 2019. That was the longest period where sufficient data was available to calibrate the model. Most of the water master and lake analysis goes back to 1977. We didn't have the calibration data. So we did look at that period. So 2009, right, lake levels went up, 2011, and then dropped to record lows around 2018. So that's the period of time that he looked at, and he did a time series model. So it did show a longer term average. That was the longest period that we had data for, but it happens to include, you know, a full lake and a record low.
Thank you.
Is that what you were asking? The
Yes.
Lake levels or levels within the lake?
Lake levels, and how the quality of water affects if you have a half full lake or a full lake. Yes.
I have a quick one. What does it entail as far as the monitoring plan? What steps are they looking for?
That is something that we anticipate negotiating with the regional board over time. So right now in the regulations for surface water augmentation, which is not what this project is doing. However, that is an existing regulation that the regional board has access to. There's a list of constituents that need to be monitored. And so that's our starting point. So what we're doing right now is getting quotes from laboratories to determine the cost of doing that monitoring plan. And then we're going to go talk with the regional board and see if we can optimize, you know, kind of fine tune what they're asking for at this phase of the project. So that we, you know, can get them enough data to feel confident moving forward, but make sure that we're limiting the cost to the extent that we can. So that'll be in the short term to get them enough data to issue the permit. And then 2 years before the project starts up, and then 2 years after the discharge begins, there's typically some additional monitoring requirements. You monitor more often. And then if you're not seeing some of these constituents in the water, then you can reduce your monitoring. And so there is an established plan for other types of projects. And our anticipation is that we may be able to use some of our pilot data to demonstrate the purity of the water and use that to potentially negotiate lesser monitoring to reduce the cost.
Just to follow up, I'm sorry. When you monitor, you're monitoring the water that is going in, not just the lake. What water are you monitoring?
Actually, both. Yeah, thank you for asking. So we need to monitor the effluent. So in the short term while the pilot is running, we're going to be taking data, taking samples of that effluent so that we can demonstrate what the quality of this purified water would be. So that's one data set. And then we do also need to monitor the existing water quality in the lake to provide a more comprehensive baseline, that they call it, so that they can compare over time if there are any changes in water quality. Okay, so the next steps, as I mentioned, we are finalizing a monitoring plan. We're going to work with the regional board to review that and anticipate that we might start those monitoring efforts around March. Certainly, we'll be testing the pilot effluent, and we may start lake monitoring at that time as well. We're going to collect that data over the course of a few quarters so that we're getting within the lake some seasonal data. Submit that to the regional board, and then we're anticipating that at that point they would deem the application complete, and then they would be able to draft an administrative order sort of in the middle of next year. And that's kind of an extra step that we're asking for, is that administrative order, and that's kind of an internal draft so that we have an opportunity to see what the permit terms are and negotiate them before it goes out to the tentative order. When the tentative order is issued, that goes out for public comment. There's a public review period, and then the regional board would be asked to adopt that order following that. So there's still quite a few more steps in the process, but we think that we've allowed sufficient time. And we're showing that permit approval at about April 2025. And so there's still a significant buffer before the program starts up in early January 2027. You don't need the permit until you start discharging. Many programs don't even apply for it until closer to discharge, but given the complexity, we wanted to start this process sooner. Okay, so moving on to grant funding. I do not have any new grants to announce for you today. So this is the recap of the information you've seen. Yet, I'll say. So because we have Title 16 funding, we know that federal grants can cover up to 25% of the total project cost. That's the Title 16 limitation. Currently, Borough has 7% state grants, 16% in federal grants, and an additional 9% that we anticipate. So that 16 and the 9 gets us to that 25% federal cap. And we believe we'll get that additional 9% from Title 16. They have another funding round that'll come out this year. The applications will be probably in June. And so the remaining funds, we'll be looking at other financing, and really focusing on state grants. The opportunity going forward is with state grants to leverage that federal funding. And I'll talk in a little bit where we're going to focus those efforts. So this is just a recap of the grants that have been we've been successful on to date. Most of them are officially awarded. A couple of them are still in those preliminary stages that grant agreements aren't accepted yet, but the funding's now. So our big opportunities going forward for grants, again, is going to be getting the rest of that 9% from Title 16 federal grant. And then we're actively evaluating additional state grant opportunities. There's a fair amount of money that's being allocated to funding agencies. And based on some work we're doing with other agencies around the state, we're hearing that the DWR is really looking to allocate a lot of that funding toward climate adaptation and resilience efforts, as well as water reuse. And this project fits generally well with all of those types of criteria that are usually applied for those funding opportunities. So we're really actively watching that and seeing how those agencies are going to be allocating the funds. We don't currently have a recommended grant program that we're looking at for the state, but I think very soon there'll be some specific opportunities to consider. And we're also investing in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund. And while that is a loan program, and it takes a very long time to get through the process, they do have loan forgiveness opportunities, which is essentially a grant. And so that's the reason that we would potentially look at that as a supplemental source. And disadvantaged communities get to take a little bit of a shortcut on the timeline. You save about maybe 6 months in a 2.5 year process. So we believe the project will be eligible for that. So that's something that we're talking to staff about. No decisions have been made there or a recommendation. That is a potential. Okay, so next, show you a few new slides that were developed, just as resources to share more about the project benefits. As this program gains momentum, we're doing more public presentations, more stakeholder meetings, and so having some additional information to share, I think will be helpful. So this is kind of a refresh of the map you've seen that really highlights the different components of the project throughout the valley. So first, of course, we're producing the new purified water source at Arwa. One option is to replace the existing Shade Pond water source with this water. And I noted this here as a future option because this discharge would be part of the NPDES discharge application. So same permit as the lake discharge, but it requires a whole second set of analysis. And so we've been focusing on the lake discharge to make sure that we can move that forward. And we haven't done a whole lot of work so far on the Shade Pond analysis. So we're kind of at the point where we could really start to dig into that. But the project team is taking a step back and really thinking about, is that the most cost-effective way to use a small portion of this water? And so I'm noting it as a future option because I think that's under further consideration. And so then all of the water produced would go into Stanfield Marsh, which of course flows into Big Bear Lake. 120 acre feet would go to replace an irrigation water source for the golf course, which is noted as a groundwater benefit due to replacing that source as kind of an in lieu recharge. Recent conversations have led to including a new water source for the bike park. And then, of course, the replenishment for the groundwater basin in Sand Canyon. And then there are some additional downstream benefits. When the lake levels are higher, there, of course, will be more downstream pieces. And the project team is partnered, well, not actually partnered, but been talking with Valley District, which is a regional agency down the San Bernardino area. And they believe that they can capture, any water that's released during high lake levels. They can capture some of that water to recharge their basin, in the San Bernardino area. So there's some additional downstream benefits for that water that can be used here locally.
So another question for you, Dave, you can help me with this. When you say new bike park, that's at Bear Mountain?
That's correct.
So, Bear Mountain had this issue years ago with spotted owl. Has that been resolved for them to be able to open that up in the summertime? Or are you done?
They've been opening up those, this is on Summit.
This is at Summit or Bear Mountain?
That's at Summit,
Okay.
yes.
Because there was an issue with Bear Mountain opening up their bike park because of a little environmental issue. So their old EIR says they were never allowed to expand the ski hill under the old EIR because of the spotted owl at Bear Mountain.
Yeah, and I'm not aware of them opening up that park at Bear Mountain, but I know for the Snow Summit, so that additional 120 acre feet that we were talking about is actually going towards their bike park at Snow Summit.
It just looked like the orientation on the map looked a little bit too far east, I guess.
It's a big logo.
I might need to scooch it over a bit. Okay, so this graph, and this black line here is historically level going back to 1977. And so what I'm gonna layer on here is the estimated benefit to the project like level from this project. And so you'll see that, and on the next slide, I'm gonna show you a zoom in of the most recent period. Really the most benefit happens during those low points, right? We do anticipate that the lake will continue to see these, sort of fill and drain cycles. But the point of this project is to kind of bring up those low lows so that we're not getting as far down as we've seen historically. And so here's a close-up of what that looks like from the 2011 to 2019 period since the lake was last full. And so based on a detailed analysis that was done by MWD and their water master consultant doing that water master model, we're seeing that based on historic hydrology and actual lake levels in the past, if this project had begun back then, we would have seen a 4.5 foot increase in lake levels from that low in 2018 when the lake was 18.2 below full. So you'll see when the lake is full, the increment there is not as much, but the lake levels are already high. So as it starts to get lower, that's really where you accumulate those benefits.
Just to clarify, looking at the previous graph, when the lake is low, volume is low, and so the percentage of water going in is higher. That's what it's demonstrating during those periods of time.
Yes, that and also, sort of the shape of the lake. So when it's lower, filling that same amount of water sort of gives you more of a gain in lake level.
Right, and when the lake is full, it's less clear.
Right.
Which logically would make sense.
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
And then in the next slide, I'm going to show you what that looks like on a map. Okay, so this, the blue there is an estimate of what the actual lake area was in December 2018, when you had that record low of 18.2 below full. And so, of course, the marsh was completely dry, and there was limited access to the lake in a lot of places. So, under those 2018 conditions, if the project had been in place, this darker blue here is the additional water coverage that you would have seen. So, during extreme drought conditions, the lake will still see those tips, but you're not going to lose as much water coverage as you would without the project. And so that's what's shown here in the dark blue. The marsh, this outline here in the marsh, that's about the minimum that you'd ever see in the marsh. Those culverts that go under the road between the marsh and the lake, they kind of act as a weir. And that will keep the marsh about this full, even if the lake is a little bit lower. So you'll see, constant wetted area in the marsh and an increase in that area. And this is really just at those minimum levels. A few years before that, when it was low but not as low, you probably would see even more of a benefit.
Come back one time. So this is on, I think, page 24. It's the graph. It goes up and down with little blue marks on it. And just as an example, In 2018, I'll call it mid 2018, the black line is water level, which is minus 12. It says minus 2 there, but I think that means minus 12.
Oh, yes.
And if it had been in place during that period of time, the difference would have been a minus, I'll call it 7 approximately.
It was about 8, yeah, so it would have been about a fourth the difference at that time.
Okay. Okay, so when the lake is low, it could be as much as a 4-foot difference.
Yeah, based on, you know, the actual lake levels and the actual hydrology in that previous period, the model results showed up to 4.5 feet during 2018, which was the lowest.
It
So
helped me a
that's-
lot because sometimes it's hard to explain.
Yeah,
When the lake is low, the benefit is much higher. When we need it more. When the lake is full, yeah, that's true. It's not, the effect is small.
right.
I see it. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there just simply isn't enough wastewater to treat to fill up the lake, right?
It's a
But
smaller percentage against
it is,
78,000 acre feet, 2,000 in. But when you're at 28,000 acre feet, 2,000 is a larger percentage. Makes it, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, I hate to jump back, but this is really like this one.
well, it's new information and a new way of presenting it, and so we really wanted to, we're hoping that these resources are more helpful, so, you know, feel free to, you know, any questions I'm happy to answer. I think this is information we want to make sure that you guys feel confident sharing. And if there's anything else that would be helpful to add to this resource besides that, let us know and we can develop that as well.
Very good. Just a quick question if I could. I appreciate the visuals. Thank you very much. It's so helpful. How long does it take to ramp up to that 4.5 foot? If you
Well,
understand what I'm saying.
You know, I do, yeah. And it depends on the natural hydrology, right? Sort of how much rain you get. But if we look at this period between 2011 and 2019, the lake was last full in 2011. So if, you know, if there was extra water, it may have spilled over. There were probably some flood releases at that time. So that sort of resets the benefits in a way, right? And so then you'll see that over the, you know, the course of those 9 years that followed that were pretty dry, it slowly accumulates. You know, each year you get that additional increment just from continuing to add this water source every single year. And so the historic benefit that we've seen was up to 4.5 feet. In the future, you know, we can use the history as an approximation of what we think might happen in the future, but it will of course depend on rainfall and lake levels as well. But I think this is a good comparison.
Thank you.
Okay, and then the groundwater benefits are, you know, also foundational to this project. And so what you're seeing here is projected groundwater pumping. And this is from the groundwater sustainability plan that was adopted last year. And you'll see towards the end there, the line kind of fans out, and that just reflects uncertainty with what it will look like that far out into the future at 2070. You know, if you don't increase your groundwater pumping, you're probably at the bottom level of that, and if it kind of goes at the same rate that it's been increasing, that's where that upper bound is. And then the black line here is comparing it to the seed field of the groundwater basin. And so you'll see right now, there's a pretty significant buffer. It steps down there in 2040, just because that's the time period that DWR uses for their climate change models. And so they're anticipating that between 2040 and 2070, there will be a long-term decline in groundwater sustainable yield. And so that's what's reflected here. It won't actually, you know, jump down in 2040, but that long-term future could be a lot closer to the groundwater pumping. Because there's no other source of water besides natural replenishment. This project, you'll see those blue lines there, they really grow that sustainable yield and give you more of a buffer and more reliability with the groundwater basin, to be able to be resilient if, you know, if those conditions do occur in the future. I think that's the last one I have on benefits. Any other questions or information that would be helpful?
The 500 acre feet though is an opportunity for the local water districts to take advantage of that. It isn't actually part of the project.
Yeah, so the 500 acre feet reflects the total of the 380 acre feet that we recharged in Sand Canyon. and the 120 acre feet that would replace the golf course water supply, that basically you leave the water in the ground for municipal use. So that's where that 500 total comes from. And, you know, that part, it is an integral part of the program, but it's not part of what BAR was funding. Is that accurate, David?
Yes.
Yeah,
So is that part of the environmental document?
yes. Okay, I'm gonna close this out. So this is just a summary of program milestones. Most of this is a buildup of the milestones that you've seen previously. So what we're really working on going forward is that pilot program that's gonna be starting up here next month. In June, we anticipate an additional grant application for the rest of that Title 16 grant funding, and BAR has also been invited to submit a WIPIA loan. And around that time, we'll be able to initiate final design as well, followed by adoption of the EIR in the fall, and then moving into construction in late 2024, operation beginning in 2027. That's the final.
Thank you. Any other questions from board members? Questions from the public? I believe this is just a presentation, now I should be taken on.
Yeah, there's no action to be taken.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, very well done.
Yes. Spreadsheet, is it possible to get extra copies of this?
Yes, they're on our.
You said it's on the website, okay.
And if we, also, we'll probably post those at the CSD's website as well, that presentation.
Okay, well, that's, presentation with me, Mr. Replenish Big Bear Finance update.
Yeah, and that's Fieldman and Rolapp, and we have Robert Ford and Laura Carpenter here, Fieldman and Rolapp, to give our presentation on the Replenish Big Bear financing plan.
Good evening, Mr. Chair, members of the board. It's a pleasure to be here this evening speaking with you about this very important project of Replenish Big Bear. My name is Laura Carpenter. I'm the Vice President at Fieldman Rolapp Associates, and I'm joined here by my colleague Robert Ford, and Executive Vice President at Fieldman. What we wanted to do today is, in order to provide an overview of the project and its funding sources, we first wanted to start with an introduction to ourselves and our firm and what we do with and for municipalities like yourself. So to start off, Fieldman Rolapp Associates is a municipal advising firm. We are registered with both the MSRB and the SEC. We've been in business for over 55 years, and for our practice itself, we are dedicated to solely helping public sectors. What our firm does with cities and counties and transportation districts, we also do for special districts such as yourself. We also work with school districts, in addition to, as I noted, K-9 agencies. Today, our sector will be purely to review and analyze the agency's Replenish Big Bear funding strategies. I'm purely working for the utility sector, as is Robert Ford. He is the head of utility practice. He has been in the business for over 35 years. He's been in actually multiple ranges of the municipal finance consultants, starting from, he's been a banker, he's been a trustee, and now we are working as your municipal advisor. I've had a career in municipal finance for over 9 years now, working solely with Fieldman Rolapp Associates, helping any type of water, sewer agency, large and small in California, work through their capital funding needs and strategies. Our utility sector is located primarily in our headquarters in Irvine. We also have an office up in San Francisco, and we have remote offices located as well in Hawaii and Seattle. Give you a little more background of our total experience. Our report and myself have a combined 44 years in the municipal finance business itself, helping public sectors and municipalities such as yourself. Not only do we look at funding strategies, but we also work with our clients to prepare long-range financial modeling work, as well as developing funding strategies that can be through pay-go needs, through debt funding needs, in addition to reviewing outstanding financial policies to ensure that you have a global aspect for your capabilities in funding large and small capital programs. We have worked in the past 5 years. Robert and myself have been with over 45 clients, helping them issue over 90 different transactions, and that's in both private and public issuances. What that means is we've worked with clients who have issued, like you have in 2011 and 2018 with private bank lenders. We've also helped issuers go into the public market and issue debts that is purchased through investors. So we've seen a wide gamut of options, and we're here as your fiduciary to provide the advice and strategies that will help you fund projects such as RBB. We've also had a lot and have a lot of with your loan experience. To date, since 2018, we've helped close almost 1.4 billion of water infrastructure needs for our clients. That includes 7 different loans that we've closed for different agencies, in addition to refunding 2 loans and amending a 3rd loan. Currently, we're working on 7 other with your loan transactions, in addition to what we're assisting the agency with, pursuant to your recent application to be invited to apply to the EPA program. And I'll be talking a lot about what the with your loan is, its terms and conditions, and I'll be happy to answer all your questions at the end of the presentation. To start off with the financing strategies, I first want to give an overview of the actual project costs. We heard a great presentation from Lane at WSC on exactly what the project is going to do for Big Bear Lake. And here we're going to talk about the actual financing costs and the funding strategy for RBB going forward. What we've shown here on the left-hand side of the screen is the total project costs. Combined construction and implementation of the RBB project is looking at approximately 75, almost 76 million. If you add on potential issuance costs for financing portions of your costs through debt financing, we're looking at a total project need and implementation of almost 77.3 million. Now, what are our current funding sources? As we just heard from Lane, we have almost $24 million of grants, and that includes the full utilization of up to the 25% of all federal grants that we hope to be receiving in that next application round. It also includes over $1 million of current cost partner contribution, leaving our total funding sources to date of almost 25 million. When you compare that to the $77 million of project needs, that leaves about $52 million of remaining funding. That $52 million can be funded with any additional grants, as Lane mentioned, maybe potential state grants in the future that can be utilized and awarded. Also, the other option is debt financing. And what I will be discussing for today for the board meeting is the strategy of using debts to finance the full remaining funding needs of almost $52 million. So the questions will be answered in the following. What is the timing? How much of this funding will look like? And what will be the impact to the agency to fund $52 million additional debt over the course of the project? The timing and implementation of this debt strategy really is going to follow through with your current timeline of the project progression. So as we just reviewed, we've been currently in the feasibility stage, starting way back in fiscal year 2019, ongoing through today's current fiscal year, or last fiscal year 2022. Those estimated costs incurred was approximately $2 million. Estimated grant fundings utilized was a little over $1 million, leaving that remaining amounts that was funded with agency cash and cost partner participation of approximately $1.40 million. Moving on to the next phase of the project, we're labeling as the pre-construction phase, starting here in fiscal year 2023, moving through fiscal year 2025. The identified estimated pre-construction needs for the project is approximately 7.6 million. We've been able to estimate for that pre-construction time period almost 4.3 million. That leaves a net funding gap of approximately 3.4 million. And today what we have before you, and this is discussion as well as a future agenda item, is discussing that interim financing debt funding need to provide that $3.4 million to the agency over this short period of the pre-construction through fiscal year 2025. The last period is labeled as the construction period. As we heard, construction will start around September 2024 and go into fiscal year 2027. Those estimated project costs to fund construction and to refinance the interim financing issue today is approximately $70 million. The remaining grant funding that we think will be available as of today is approximately $18 million. And that leaves our remaining $52 million that we'll be discussing as debt funding and strategy needs today. Now, the first part of our debt funding strategy is our pre-construction funding, which will be the interim financing located in your next agenda item as well for the documentation. But to bring it into full perspective, what I wanted to provide is the timeline of how this interim financing began, where we are, when will it close, and what are the terms and conditions of this interim financing for pre-construction funds. We went out to bids in December of 2022 to a list of private bank lenders. We were able to receive multiple bids from 5 private institutions in January 5th of this year. And our goal here tonight is for the board to consider the approval of the authorizing resolution and those underlying documents, allowing us to close the loan and provide funding to the agency on February 3rd. What does that funding entail? It involves the funding of $3.4 million, as we saw on the prior slide, for pre-construction needs. It is locked in at a fixed cost of 4.25% over the term of the interim financing, which is approximately 3 years, a little over 3 years, through May of 2026. This interim financing is structured as interest-only cost through the full term of the loan. You'll be paying that final principal balance at maturity at that May 15th, 2026 timeframe. What is really key here in our loan negotiations is this bank not only provided the lowest bid for the fixed interest rates, but they also provided the most attractive call feature, such that in a little over a year from now, May 2024, the agency will have an opportunity to prepay this interim financing in whole or in part with available funds. Those funds can come from outstanding grants that received at that time frame or from our future construction funding needs. And when that large portion of the construction funding will be through the Whitfield loan. That construction prepayment is a very important feature that we think puts this lending from Capital One at a very strategic stance for the agency to fund your projects as well as continue down the construction timeline. This loan agreement will be paid after your 2011 and 2018 debt that's currently outstanding, and the estimated cost to complete the loan and close it for funding on February 3rd is a little over $70,000. What I've been mentioning is the refunding of interim financing with your future construction funding. Now, we wanted to go over on the next slide is what the construction funding entails and what are the options the agency has to continue funding that remaining amount. What amount we're referring to is that $52 million remaining needs for RBB that we broke up into what can be funded from the Whitfield loan, approximately $42 million, and a small portion of other debt funding strategies, $10 million, that could potentially also be funded from grants if those are available and awarded down this project timeline. So the uses of our construction funding, again, will be to refinance the interim financing that we're looking into closing today, as well as funding all of your construction needs. There are 2 ways that the agency can fund the construction needs for the $42 million of the Whitfield loan. One opportunity or one way that you can fund the construction is through the Whitfield loan draws themselves. The agency can draw directly from the Whitfield loan program at its fixed interest rate, which will be comparable to a U.S. Treasury rate. And to put that rate into perspective, today a 30-year U.S. Treasury rate will be around 3.6%. The other option that the agency has, which we will be looking into to provide additional flexibility and potential future savings, is a short-term note to fund the construction funding. What that means is the agency can then draw from a short-term facility that actually incurs a cost at tax-exempt rates. Now, this rate is tax exempt, meaning that for investors who do purchase this debt, they get a tax exempt advantage. Their income is exempt from federal and California state income tax, so they are willing to provide a lower rate for this type of loan program. And that rate could be in the low threes as of today's market. So the first opportunity or the first reason why the agency might be looking to fund a note issuance for the construction timeline through fiscal year 2027, one is potential lower cost of interest. Another reason to pursue a short-term note for the construction funding is what the WIFIA loan classifies as development default. Going forward, as we work through this WIFIA loan process, we'll be bringing back before the board documentation of the WIFIA loan agreements. One of the documents terms is called development default. What that means is there's a date in the WIFIA loan agreement, which typically is 24 months after substantial completion of the project. So if the agency completes the project in 2027, your development default date will be 2029. If the agency exceeds that date, the project is not completed prior to that 2029 date, for example, it classifies as a development default, which means the agency would have to accelerate and pay immediately all funds that have been drawn from the WIFIA loan. One way to avoid incurring that default is to not draw from the WIFIA loan and instead use this note financing to fund all the construction, and at the time the project is completed, then draw all the funds needed for the WIFIA loan and repay it through the WIFIA loan terms. And I'll go into what those terms are on the next slide. The last really opportune reason to utilize a note facility or a note income financing for construction is the refunding opportunity that EPA, which is the Development Protection Agency that administers the WIFIA loan program, they have a refunding opportunity for their issuers. If an agency does not draw directly from the WIFIA loan, 1 year after issuance, you're able to look at the market, reevaluate, and if market conditions are lower, and you can prove that there are savings, you can then refinance that loan. So we want to be able to keep in your financing strategy, your funding strategy, an opportunity for future refunding possibilities to gain additional interest savings for your ratepayers. The WIFIA loan itself, again, is to fund the $42 million of gap funding for the RBB project. As I noted, it is a federal credit program administered by the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's labeled the Water Infrastructure and Finance Innovation Act. It is a long-term, low-interest government subsidized funding program, and has some really key terms that benefit agencies like yourself. One of which, as I mentioned, is at closing, be able to fix a U.S. Treasury rate of similar maturity plus 0.01%. What that means is any issuer, if they close on the same date and they have the exact same weighted average maturity, they will always get that rate in the market plus 0.01%. So it's a very attractive feature the EPA program provides, as well as the amount of funding. For eligible agencies such as yourself, you can acquire up to 80% of eligible project costs directly through the WIFIA loan. What they also have another requirement is for entities using the WIFIA loan program, you can't exceed total federal funding of 80%. So we do have identified, as noted by WSC and this presentation, almost 25% of federal funding, which means our additional funding that can be drawn from WIFIA loan is slightly reduced, and that is why we're only able to utilize about $42 million remaining funding from the WIFIA loan. Lastly, another key term and condition is the ability to repay the loan program over a long 35-year term, and the agency does not have to start repaying on that loan until after substantial completion of the project. So for this project, that will mean you don't have to repay until after 2027. And another great feature is you can prepay this loan at any time. So any year, once a year, at a minimum of $500,000, the agency can go to the WIFIA loan program and say, we would like to prepay a part of the loan, or you can even prepay it in whole throughout the term of the loan. And for that perspective, for an agency issuing in the public market, usually there's a 10-year lockout period where you're unable to prepay or call loans and reduce that interest rate. So it's a very attractive feature. Here we've identified the overall WIFIA process and its timeline. We were able to submit a letter of interest back in September 7th of last year. We were invited to apply to the program on October 18th. And we are expecting to submit an application to the loan program by June of this year. At that time, that's when we'll start the negotiations with the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and all their consulting teams to work through a loan documents that will be brought back before the board for final review and approval. We're looking to close the Wicked loan in February, and in between February and your construction timeline, starting in September 2024, that will be the time where we look at all the risks and rewards of potentially drawing for the Whitfield loan, that will do a treasury rate, or if we're going to be utilizing that short-term note program. Whether that interest rate is lower, providing you additional benefit on savings, or whether we think there's a risk to the loan default, the strategy to utilize a note will avoid that risk. So there's multiple opportunities down the road here that we can review with staff and the board to determine what that best strategy is at the time of construction, where to receive the funds from. And the last portion of the $52 million gap funding, again, was this $10 million remaining funding needs, which could potentially be drawn from a grant if such is awarded. If not, the other funding strategy we utilize is through debt. And that can be either funded through a private placement lender or bank lender, such as what you did back in 2011 and 2018, and what we're looking into now for financing, or it can be done through the public market. And that decision will also be based on cost of issuance of the transaction and actual market rate cost at the time that we enter into that loan. Now, what does this all mean for the funding plan and the impact to borrowers' revenue needs and rates? What this requires of agency and ratepayers is a multi-year revenue increase to fund the full cost of the RBB projects, as well as the potential interest costs on the debt financings and repayments down the line. Fiscal year 2028 identifies the first full year of the project being in operation, and also at that time we expect to have the full amount of rates fully collected to start funding the remaining operation costs as well as debt repayments. Right now, that estimate for that full rate collection for RBB is approximately $220 per EDU. Now, that cost is all based on multiple market assumptions of where interest rates may be in the future at the time the agency will be entering into such debt. So to end the presentation, I did want to go over a market update for the agency so they can see where current and historical rates have been for the U.S. Treasury, as well as for our tax exempt rates utilized for construction funding loans. This graph before you shows the comparison of the U.S. Treasury curve. Last year, in January of 2022, is shown on the bottom green line, where the 1-year maturity was as low as almost 50 basis points, and the 30-year maturity was almost as high as 2%. Since January of 2022, that rate has significantly increased. You referred to the red line that represents the U.S. Treasury curve as of January 18th, where the front end of the yield curve has increased over 4% to almost 4.5%, and the back end has increased over 1.5%, looking at around a 3.5%. Today, as I noted, that rate is approximately 3.6%. So over the course of 2022, the Federal Reserve has increased their short-term Federal Reserve target rates, and that has impacted the U.S. Treasury curve, in addition to our tax-exempt curve, which we show here on the next slide. This represents the municipal market data, which is our benchmark curve for tax-exempt issuers. It represents highly rated AAA rated entities going out to the market. The blue bar graphs in front of your screen, they represent where the range of those rates have been over the 30-year curve since 2005. What the red line represents is where we see the current tax-exempt curve in today's market. So we're still not at the highest level we've seen rates in 2005, while they are not historically at the lowest they've been, they're still fairly attractive on an overall historical basis. And right now we're looking at a 30-year tax-exempt AAA rating, or excuse me, AAA interest rate, approximately 3.2%. So it's still lower than our taxable U.S. Treasury curve. And at that time, that concludes our presentation. I'm happy to go for questions.
U.S. Treasury slide that you have. Can you explain how that affects the rates, how it might affect our rates going forward?
That is a great question. So What we currently are seeing is an inverted yield curve. This year's treasury curve will be directly tied to the rate you get on your with your loan. So the time you execute your with your loan, unfortunately not before, so we're looking at a closing date of February 2024. We'll still see market movement between now and February 2024. So the date of closing, the date you enter into, finalize your loan agreements, you will be issued interest rates based off of a similar maturity of the US Treasury rates the date that you close. So if, for example, today or on January 18th, you close the loan and your similar maturity was a 30-year weighted average life, you would be receiving 3.5 plus 1%. So 3.51% would be your final interest rate on the loan agreement.
And the trend now might have a lower interest rate by 2024 when we're funding.
So the so there's a lot of movement between now and February 2024. Federal Reserve is looking to increase its short-term Federal Reserve target rates February 1st, upcoming next week in their meeting, 1/4 basis point. Now, there's not a direct correlation between the Federal Reserve increasing short-term rates and how that impacts the full US Treasury curve, but there is constant statements from the Federal Reserve that throughout 2023, they will continue to increase their short-term rates, which does impact both US Treasury rates and the tax-exempt municipal market rates. So throughout 2023, it will be volatile. We do expect to see rates increase, but our hope is that starting in 2024, hopefully we will see a decline and hopefully maybe even additional tax rate cuts or cuts on the Federal Reserve funds. But hard to tell where this line will move in the future.
There's a lot of talk about a recession. Recessions usually lower interest rates.
Correct, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I had a question back on, I think it's, but it deals with the Whitfield loan. Is the Whitfield loan, is the 42 million the max that they're willing to fund the project? Or is there just an assumption that we're going to get $10 million in grants, therefore we only need $42 million?
Great question, Director. 42 million, based off of your current project cost of 77 million, 42 is the maximum they're able to utilize from your loan program due to their 80% limitation.
And I'm assuming then the grants have to be in place at the time with you. The other $10 million has to be in place or committed at the time of Whitfield will approve that loan.
It's an estimate of your future funding needs. So if the 10 million is not available from state grants that are awarded to the agency, there is times to commit to additional funding down the line. What we'll be telling EPA is what those funding sources may entail, but you are capped at certain federal funding limitations. So if the 10 million currently you receive from federal purposes, we then have to lower your Whitfield loan appropriately.
So it has to be from state because.
Yeah, that's one of the way to make this happen is to get, we're limited to 25% federal funding.
Right.
So the grants, we are right now, we are about 16 million federal grants, or about 11, so we have availability of probably about another 7 million from federal grants that we have available. That total number of about 19 limits the amount that we can get from the Whitfield loan because it has that limitation of 80% of federal funding. So it's actually the current grants that we have in place that's going to limit the 80% and not the other 10 million, which still gives us a lot of availability for state grants, but less for federal grants. We're basically done with federal grants. Now we need to focus on state grants.
So then moving forward on the project, we have to be, the board, I guess, has to be somewhat assured that those state grants are going to be available at that time.
We have to be looking for additional federal grants, but there's always an option for a private placement or floating bonds at that point for the additional $10 million. So that's right now, because we don't know how many more state grants we can get. We're not really looking too much at that until a later date, because we'll be able to look at, again, private placement or bond issuance. And it depends on the amount we're looking at, whether we do either one, and those and the cost for financing.
And I guess one of my other concerns too is obviously that once you get the funding in place, if we do go out for another funding source for the 10 million, then the opportunity to apply for grants kind of falls to the floor because if we can't justify a need anymore.
Well, I mean, at a certain point in time, if we have funding in place, obviously funding in place, I mean, grants are always good. We could always, we wouldn't be looking for that loan until we actually needed it. So I would suspect that all of that, state grant and those opportunities will be well vetted by the time we actually go out for those additional loans.
Thank you.
Is there an equivalent limit on the state grants? Is federal 25%, is there anything?
There is, not to my knowledge, no.
Okay, and thank you for the great presentation, very detailed. Did I catch on the WIPIA loan, did I catch that there was a minimum 500,000 on the prepayment?
That is what we've been able to agree to on private loan agreements, so the minimum prepayment threshold has been 500,000.
Correct. And then what is it's obviously processes probably, but between June of 2023 and February 2024 until close, what happens during that time frame?
You will have some busy worker bees here on consultancy, but in general, EPA will be hiring their own consultants. So they will have their own legal team, they will have their own underwriter, and they'll also have their own financial consultants. They will be preparing their documents, and during the course of the loan negotiations, the agency's team will have our own bond counsel. You'll be utilizing us as a mutual advisor, again, fiduciary to your needs, negotiating on behalf of the agency through the EPA program. And what we'll be doing is negotiating the loan agreement itself. The loan agreement will include all the terms and conditions that I've referenced, in addition to other conditions that they require, untitled rate covenants that the agency will have to meet moving forward, additional future parity obligations, issue new debts. So all of that will be discussed in the loan agreement during the time frame between application submittal and final application closing. In addition, you will be needing a credit rating. So our assistance will be to help the agency finalize a credit rating from the national outstanding rating agencies such as Standard & Poor's. And that final credit rating will be utilized by EPA's own credit counsel. They'll review it through their internal procedures, and then they'll also have to get it approved by their OMB board, in addition to, of course, your approval of the documents before closing.
Thank you. And then last one, is there any chance to pre-look the rates before the February? There's no option for that?
There's no option, unfortunately. The only way to close earlier is to accelerate the timeline of the actual loan negotiations, and at closings when they'll only fix in the rates. And of course, a loan closing will be dependent upon also environmental needs. EPA has a long list of federal guidelines and environmental procedures that have to complete as well before the loan closure.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions?
Just so I'm clear, so the 220 EDU is based upon a $42 million.
The 220 is actually based on the entire $52 million loan.
52 million.
That's correct.
Assuming we don't get any more grants, we'll be.
Assuming we don't get any more grants, that's correct.
You had mentioned the short-term loan in place of the weed loan. And that is a market rate loan? That we're talking about, your bank loan?
Yes. So if at the time that you need to acquire construction funding, which we estimate to be after loan closing between February, when you need the funds in September 2024, the option for the agency will be directly drawn from the WIPIA loan program at that fixed interest rate, or a market driven at the time you enter into that interim financing, the rate at the time of closing. We will be comparing the pros and cons, so to speak, the risk and benefits of a short-term interest rate. Is it lower? Is it going to provide savings to the agency ratepayers? And as well as those other two opportunities, is there a potential future 6 to 12 months from now where we can lower your WIPIA loan? Therefore, we would steer more heavily towards not drawing the WIPIA loan program. And then, of course, any default risk we want to take into clear conscious where we think those risks will be at the time of issuance.
So we don't move forward with that because the benefits of the agency.
That's correct.
You won't know that until we get there.
That's right.
It's basically, we get one opportunity for the rate reset during that period. So we actually have an opportunity to look at the rate to see if we're going to be able to reset the rate and get a lower interest rate if you know, current projections are that the rate's gonna go back down. So that would be another reason why to wait and not draw on with the money at that point.
Thank you. Any comments from the public on this item? Next, coming forward, that's, we'll bring it back, and this is a receiving file presentation.
That's correct.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, nice one. Okay, this is information committee report, no manager report 6A.
Yeah, at this time, actually, I have no additional report to add to my general manager report, but I'm open for any questions if there are any.
Any questions for David?
I didn't understand, I'm sorry, David. The one chart at the very end. Said in the influent flow chart, I didn't understand why that line, what does average dry weather flow mean?
So the agency has, over the last, I would say 10 years or so, we have an average, dry weather flow. And that's what that line is, shows on the graph is that average, dry weather, flow. And so we compare that to what we actually see to figure out whether we're within that, average dry weather flow or we're, beyond it.
So why does it jump up? Is it because of the KCI or?
It's usually, that's the time of the year we see the most of our flow, from snow melt and those kind of things, so most of that is I&I, and we also have, you know, holidays involved in those kind of things.
Thanks.
Any questions for David? Invite public, let's see. None, we'll move on to finance committee. Who would you like to report? I'll jump in.
Well, sure, well, we received an excellent presentation from Jennifer and help Christine on our finance committee. And well, we went through basically where we stand this year, where we think we're headed with our rate increase. I think that's all I can really add, Rick.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very clear what we're looking at. Appreciate that. Okay, with that, we'll move on to item 7, consent calendar. Item to remove from the consent calendar. Now is there a motion to approve the consent? Move to approve.
Second.
Move to second. Roll call, please.
Vice Chair Green,
Aye.
Director Miller,
Aye.
Director Moat,
Aye.
Director Walsh,
Aye.
and Chair Harris.
Aye. Moving on to old business, 9A, is to appropriate $31,045 rate study. Update the update for the contingency fund.
And Jennifer McCullers is going to give us the presentation on.
All right, we are asking the board to appropriate a little over 31,000 for an update to our rate study. As the board knows, we did complete a rate study in 2022 last year with HDR Engineering. At that time, we did include a rate component for Replenish figure that covered the interest expense only on debt borrowed to fund the pre-construction period, which is what we're talking about right now. As far as the interim loan that's on the agenda for tonight. The study does need to be updated to include the estimated costs for the project, the Replenish figure project, both the pre-construction costs as well as the post-startup costs. Both the pre and post-startup costs, including the construction period as well as, you know, when the operation is underway. We do expect that the rate schedule will be developed that reflects the transition of the necessary rate adjustments over a multi-year schedule. As far as the financial impact, there are adequate funds available to make the appropriation, and we're recommending the appropriation of $31,050 to move forward on the rate study. We do anticipate being on schedule for this rate study with a presentation to the board at the February board meeting. So given that we are moving forward, or potentially moving forward with our existing rate, so they are able to meet that schedule. So we'll be on track. Thank you.
Board questions? Yes, sir.
So this will also be completed by HDR Engineering? Yes.
It's less than 30 days.
Was that?
Less than a 30-day timeline?
Yes, we did speak with them in advance. We did go through what, you know, they did the study last year, and so we do a 5-year projection. So they do have projections through 2027. So we talk about additional information that they're gonna need.
It's another year of projection, finalizing the budget, tightening up what's gonna be in the budget this year, plus adding some of the components for Replenish Repair. After talking through with them what the expectation would be, they're confident they're gonna be able to deliver that report at the February board meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jim, your comment?
No, I think.
Sorry.
I had one question.
Yes, John, go.
Excuse me if I'm a little slow. The 220 per EDU, that covers like 45 million, is that it? Is that what I was looking at? Anyway, if that's the case, the 220 per EDU, that is above and beyond the EDUs we charge now, or is that what's our current charge on EDUs, and is that combined total, I guess is what I'm asking?
Yeah, so right now, the $220 per EDU is actually an additional charge to the current one. That is about 230, 240, 246.
Okay, so that's what I thought. That being said, I'm looking at the numbers and my brain's in half speed right now. It's a COVID brain. But so we're only looking at about $18 to $20 a month for the ask is what I crunched, but does that sound about right just for the project?
But, well, the rate study.
Per
we
resident.
should be talking about the right thing. The rate study is actually just for the current rate based upon the borrowing that we're looking at to get us through pre-construction.
Yeah, and to your point, yeah, so it would be, the additional RVB cost would be about $20, between $18 and $20 a month. I think that's what he was getting at, is that if you divide the 220 by 12, you get about $18 per EDU. So
Yeah, 'cause that's
the addition per month.
that's the question I get asked most. What's it gonna cost us? So, at 18 to 20 a month, I think that's a reasonable number. I mean, if we can get it lower, great. But right, looking like that's approximately where we're gonna be in the ballpark of. That's all I had.
It's perfect.
I have a question. Here, 1 second, I'll call you just a moment. Well, we're looking at a rate study right now. We're not increasing to 220, an additional 220 this next rate cycle.
No, so.
Okay, I just want to be sure we're clear right now. That's
Oh,
correct.
no. So that would be
Okay.
by 2028. So by 2028 is the first full year of operation, the first full year of having a rate impact. In 2028, we would anticipate needing $220 per EDU incremental cost to cover the full operation.
Right, that's.
It's not 2024. So we're looking at a multi-year rate schedule beginning in 2024 through 2027. So that's operation. So over that period of time, we would anticipate starting to collect portions of that $220 an EDU. When we looked at examples of rate smoothing in the finance committee meeting, said, okay, if we're going to smooth out those rate increases between now and through 2027, we would be looking at $50 a year increase, incremental increases each year to reach the $220. Okay?
And that's based upon current expense projections.
Yes, based on
Current
current,
construction, current interest rates.
yes,
All those sort of
Yeah.
things that we might
Yes.
not know, appears might go down as we move forward.
yes. So when we met with the finance committee, we went through all the assumptions that we would anticipate putting in the rate study that we're getting ready to do. And it did include all of those components that you're talking about.
Okay. Okay, so the rate increase for 2024 is going to be fractional of that 220.
That's correct.
And we'll find out when you get the rate study done.
Yes. So we have a pretty good idea of where we're gonna be.
Okay, I'd like to take comments from the public. See, so when you can come forward, because we need you on the mic. Oh, wow. Doesn't work, it does Zoom.
Give it a second.
It's gonna do.
It just takes a minute to warm up.
Just a real quick question, approximately how many EDUs are invalid that we're talking about?
About 25,000. 25,300, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
All right, okay. Any other comments, questions from the public on the side? We're back to the board for other comments. Motion,
Motion to approve staff's recommendation.
Second.
Move the second. There no further discussion, roll call?
Vice Chair Green,
Aye.
Director Miller,
Aye.
Director Mo,
Aye.
Director Walsh,
Aye.
and Chair Herrick.
Aye. Item 1010A is resolution for funding the Replenish paper project. And I think Jennifer can use for microphone, so I presume Jennifer.
It is her.
Yeah, thank you very much. We are asking the board to approve a resolution that authorizes the execution and delivery of a loan agreement and the promissory note thereto. We did start this project back in 2019 and through 2022, the last fiscal year. We've been funding much of the project with contributions from our cost-sharing partners as well as grant funding. Last year during the budget development process, we did recognize that we need to start to borrow funds to continue financing for this project. And to cover the costs, we anticipate, the pre-construction period to run us through the early part of 2025. And we would need to borrow a loan, the interim loan. At that time, we did start collecting a rate of $5.79 per EU, which was approved to cover the interest expense associated with this interim loan. At the beginning of this fiscal year, in anticipation of this interim loan, the agency did conduct a professional services RFP, and in August 2022, we engaged the services of Fieldman and Rolapp to advise the agency on a comprehensive financing plan for this project that did include this interim loan. Fieldman and Rolapp did work with a placement agent, a placement agent to secure competitive proposals for the loan. In summary, Capital One Public Funding LLC did provide the most competitive terms. We needed $3.4 million. They offered that a 3-year loan at a 4.25% fixed interest rate. Debt service requirements are interest only, meaning we don't have to pay principal payments through the term of the loan with a lump sum at the end of the last year. That's not a problem, and that we expect this loan to be refunded prior to maturity with the construction funding. And we just kind of walk through that. The construction funding will cover the cost of construction, and we'll use the construction funding to repay this loan. So let's talk a little bit about the financial impact. The rate that we did collect and are collecting, the $5.79 per EU, is adequate to cover the interest expense on this loan. The annual rate collection is expected to be a little over $146,000, and the interest expense on the loan is $144,500. So we're good in that regard. The one thing we have to look at is if the project doesn't move forward to construction and we don't secure the construction funding to repay this, we have to manage that bullet at maturity. So our agency would approach the market or the lender to secure a conventional amortizing loan where we're actually paying the loan off under standard terms, which would include principal and interest payments. Our agency is financially strong and can afford an amortizing loan under our existing rate structure. We would have to come back to the board and go, hey, we've got to increase rates because now we have this amortizing loan and, we have to make sure we can afford the debt service. We can afford the debt service right now under our existing rate structure. When we look at our pro forma debt service coverage with interest expense only, we're about 2.95 times coverage. When we look at having to support an amortizing loan, if we look at the 3.4 million over 15 years at 5%, we're at 2.3 times. So you can see that we're very solid, financially strong. We can still cover this size of loan on an amortizing basis. The other thing that's important to consider is if we go ahead and absorb this loan, what does that do to the agency's debt capacity? So when we look at our capital plan, we do use debt to finance some of those projects. Even if we had to absorb this loan, we still have about $1 to $3 million in additional debt capacity we could go out and borrow to help fund those projects that have been identified in our capital plan as needing debt finance. So based upon that, we do recommend that the board authorize the execution of the loan agreement, approve the resolution which authorizes the execution of the loan agreement, the note, and the placement agent agreement referenced thereto. That's it.
Questions?
One quick one, if I could.
Yes, sir. Yes.
Does the EDU $5 something, is that above and beyond the 220 or is that part of the 220?
Before.
Yeah, so that,
It's going to be part of, it was before, excuse me.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we didn't have outliers change the numbers. Thank you.
It'll be part of it.
Sorry, it will be part of it.
Yeah, so it'll be part of the 220, John, just so that we're clarified. It is, the $5.79 is already part of that 220.
Yeah, I assumed it was. I just wanted to be clear.
Yes.
So that kind of ties into my question then. So this gets paid off with the Whitfield loan, or is that how that works?
It's gonna get paid off with the construction funding, and so just like Laura was saying, we have two options. We can either use the Whitfield loan and draw down on it at the beginning of the construction and fund it that way, depending on the interest rates and other potential decision points at the time we start construction. The other option is that we would do this 2-year note that would carry us through the construction period. We would borrow enough at that time, not to just cover the construction costs, but to repay this fund.
And then, and that in effect is John's response to John's question, is that ultimately is part of the 220
Yes.
at the end, yeah.
Clerk.
The project funding talked about 3.4 million, actually 3.369. This resolution talks about 3.4.
3.4 million.
Are they, is that the same number?
Yes, it is.
Okay, because up in your third whereas, you talk about replenish as A, got it. B, it says improvements to the oxidation ditch. Is that a replenish thing?
The reason why that's in there is we were trying to cover ourselves. For example, if the project does not move forward, we're drawing down on this loan. And we're not, using it all at once, we're using it as we progress through the pre-construction period. If this project didn't move forward, we'd be sitting here with a loan and not having the ability to use the funds for other things. And so we looked at our capital plan and said, let's put a couple of these projects in here in case we found ourselves in that situation. We could utilize the funds to our advantage if that happened.
Okay, so the same thing would be true for the
Asphalt repair.
repaving.
Mhm.
And I had a question about the repaving. If you're looking at doing all this construction, do you really want to repave now before the construction is done, or wait till after all the traffic's gone in and out?
Yeah, so the traffic, normal traffic impact to the road bed out here would not really be affected. Affect the paving that we're talking about, or the construction, traffic that we're talking about really wouldn't affect. It's a normal load, and so it would not impact the actual road bed itself. So I don't think that's an issue. There's interior paving on the plant, and that we're gonna be holding off on until all the project has been finished, and so that way anything we're cutting up, we can actually repave nicely. So
Mr. Ray, I'll elaborate on it because this is a question actually asked Jennifer earlier today. It is actually not part of Replenish. Although it states it in here, that Replenish does not move forward at a certain point, we're sitting on cash from a loan, what do we do? Possibly that cash, if we refinance it, a long-term loan, we have other projects used for. So it's not in conjunction with the construction of the Replenish.
She just needs to find out about it.
Okay, well, tied to the road, you asked a question that should have to do with, do you repay? Well, before.
When do you want to repay? Before or after you run all the equipment in?
Well, our board would approve that.
And I guess my question, isn't that a county road, just your point? I mean, I don't know, I just always assumed it was.
Yeah, but unfortunately, the agency has decided years ago that it would take responsibility for the road as part of the development agreement for I believe it was the admin building. So that's how that took place. Years ago.
Neighbors there.
Keep neighbors happy.
You have more questions, Jessica?
This one, very thorough agreement. I appreciate the level of detail. I actually talked to Jen earlier, so I'll just reiterate my question. Under the section 3.4 with prepayment, so just to clarify, there's no prepayment penalties. As we discussed, right? So, beginning May 15th of 2024, we can pay this loan without penalty.
no premiums on it. So that's really advantageous. And we're said it's a little over a year out from when we close. And so it does give us a lot of flexibility to prepay if we need to without any penalties.
Thank you. Thanks for the work.
Any other board questions? Any comments, questions from the audience? Ready to see them? Back to the board. For questions or possible?
Looking for a motion or?
I'm looking for a motion.
Motion.
Any question?
I'll move.
I'll second.
Further discussion, roll call please.
Vice Chair Green,
Aye.
Director Miller,
Aye.
Director Moat.
Aye.
Director Walsh
Aye.
and Chair Harris.
Aye. Thank you. Moving on to item 11A, general manager comments.
I have no additional comment.
11B, board member comments. Any comments today?
I just want to say thank you, Elaine and Laura and your team members and excellent presentations and really proud of the speech. So thank you and just thank you to David and Jennifer and district staff, Christine and everybody. Great job.
I'll do it over there.
Thank you very much.
Any other comments? Well, then, thank you very much. We'll adjourn the meeting.
Hi, John.
Ready for all those questions.